Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today's theme is one that comes up in the comments constantly. Abandoned places, old houses, shut down hospitals, empty schools. The kind of places that pull you in because something about them just feels wrong in a way you can't quite explain until you're standing inside one. Today I've got 3 stories from people who went looking for an empty building and found out it wasn't as empty as they thought. If something like this has happened to you, I want to hear it in the comments. New here? Hit subscribe. We do this every week. Let's get into it. So, a little backstory first, because I think it matters. I've always been into this stuff. Urban exploring, abandoned buildings, whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to pretend it's some noble hobby. Honestly, it's mostly just curiosity and the rush of being somewhere you're not supposed to be. I'd done probably 15 or 20 of these before this happened. Old factories, a couple shut down schools, one really creepy abandoned motel that honestly should have been its own story. I knew the general rules. Go during the day if you can, tell someone where you're going, don't go too deep alone. I broke basically all of those rules the night this happened, and I think about that a lot. There was this old hospital, maybe 40 minutes outside the city, that had been closed for something like 15 years. It used to be a psychiatric facility, from what I could find online, though by the time it actually closed, it had transitioned into more of a general care building for a while, before finally shutting down for good. The kind of place that has its own little local legend status. You know the type. Every town's got one. Kids say it's haunted, there's grainy photos floating around online. Somebody's cousin supposedly went in once and never talks about it. I found out about it through a forum, one of those urban exploring communities where people share locations and sometimes photos, careful not to give exact addresses because a lot of these places get torn down or sealed up once they get too much traffic. Someone had posted recently that the fencing around this hospital had a gap in it, that the building was still mostly accessible, and that was basically all I needed. I went on a Friday night in October. I'd told myself originally I'd go during the day on a weekend, but work got in the way that week, and Friday night was just when I had the free time. And I figured, whatever, I've got a good flashlight, I'll be fine. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I told my roommate I was going to check out a spot, which in hindsight was an insanely vague thing to say given what almost happened. The drive out there was unremarkable. 40 minutes of mostly empty road, a couple gas stations, then a stretch where the houses got farther apart and the trees got thicker. I found the turnoff easy enough, parked my car off the shoulder of a side road about a quarter mile from the building itself because I didn't want it visible from the main road. Walked in from there. The building came into view through the trees before I expected it to. 5 stories, big brick structure, the kind of architecture that just screams institutional even from a distance. Most of the windows on the lower floors were boarded, but a lot of the upper floor windows were just broken out, dark gaps against the brick. The fence around the property was chain link, rusted, and sure enough there was a section near the back that had been cut and pulled back enough to slip through. I want to be honest. The second I got through that fence, something in my gut told me to turn around. I didn't listen to it. I never do. That's kind of the whole problem with this hobby if I'm being real with myself. The main entrance was boarded solid, but there was a side door, what looked like it used to be a loading or service entrance, that was just hanging open on broken hinges. I went in there. The inside was about what you'd expect. Years of decay, water damage staining the ceilings, debris everywhere, that distinct smell that old abandoned buildings get, mold and dust and something else underneath it that I've never been able to fully describe. My flashlight beam was doing most of the work. The moon wasn't giving much through the broken windows that high up. I spent maybe the first hour just on the ground floor, taking pictures, exploring what used to be admin offices and a cafeteria area, tables still in place, some of them flipped over, chairs scattered. It was exactly the kind of content I was hoping to find, honestly. Eerie in that quiet, decayed way, without anything actually threatening about it. Around what I think was close to midnight, I decided to head up to the second floor. The stairwell was concrete, echoing in a way that made every footstep sound louder than it should have. I remember pausing at the second floor landing for a second, just listening, the way you do in these places out of habit more than actual concern. That's when I heard it the first time. A sound from somewhere above me, not loud, more like a scrape. Metal on concrete maybe, the kind of sound an old gurney or a metal cart might make if something bumped it. I froze on the landing and just listened. Nothing followed it. I told myself it was probably the building settling. These places make all kinds of weird sounds as they shift and decay, and I kept going. The second floor had been some kind of patient ward. Long hallway, rooms on either side, most of the doors either missing entirely or hanging at odd angles. I walked down that hallway slowly, flashlight sweeping each room as I passed it. Most of them were empty except for debris, the occasional rusted bed frame, water stains making weird shapes on the walls and ceiling. About halfway down the hall, I heard the scraping sound again, closer this time, and from somewhere ahead of me rather than above. I stopped walking completely. My heart was going harder than I wanted to admit. I called out, asked if anyone was there, which I know in hindsight wasn't the smartest move if there actually was someone there, but it's instinct. You want to know. No answer. The sound didn't repeat. I stood there for what felt like a full minute just listening to nothing, and eventually convinced myself it was nothing, some piece of debris shifting on its own from a draft or settling, and kept walking. I made it to the end of that hallway into what looked like it used to be a nurse's station. The old counter still mostly intact, papers and files scattered across the floor that had clearly been picked through by other explorers or animals or both over the years. I was crouched down looking at some of the old paperwork, genuinely fascinated by it, honestly, when I heard footsteps. Not the scraping sound this time. Actual footsteps, clear and deliberate, coming from the hallway I'd just walked down. Slow, even, like someone walking calmly rather than rushing. I killed my flashlight immediately. Stupid reflex, I know, because it meant I couldn't see anything either, but in the moment it felt like the right move. Like making myself less visible mattered more than being able to see. I crouched lower behind the nurse's station counter and just listened. The footsteps kept coming, steady, getting closer. I could hear them on the same hard floor I'd just walked across, that particular hollow echo concrete and old tile makes. I genuinely thought in that moment that I was about to find out I wasn't alone in that building in the worst possible way. The footsteps stopped. I don't know exactly where, somewhere down that hallway, close enough that it felt like just around a corner from where I was hiding, but far enough I couldn't be sure. There was a long stretch of total silence after that. I stayed frozen behind that counter for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3 or 4, based on what I remember of my phone's clock when I finally checked it. Then I heard breathing, not my own. Close. Close enough that it genuinely sounded like it was on the other side of the counter from me, maybe 4 or 5 feet away. Slow and deliberate breathing that did not match the pace of someone who'd just been walking. I'm not a particularly brave person, and I want to be clear that what I did next wasn't bravery. It was pure panic. I turned my flashlight back on and pointed it over the top of the counter toward where the breathing seemed to be coming from. There was nothing there. Empty hallway. Debris on the floor. Nothing standing. Nothing crouched. Nothing in all the beam of my light. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I calmly assessed the situation after that. I bolted. I ran back down that hallway toward the stairwell, flashlight beam jumping wildly with every step, and I genuinely don't remember most of the run down to the ground floor. Adrenaline does something to your memory. I've read about it since. Fight or flight basically overrides your ability to form clear memories sometimes, and that tracks with how fragmented that part of the night is in my head. What I do remember, in pieces, is the stairwell itself. I remember thinking, even mid-panic, that the echo of my own footsteps sounded wrong somehow, like there was a slight delay underneath them, a second set of footsteps just a half beat behind mine that I couldn't be sure was actually there, or was just the natural echo bouncing off concrete walls.
I didn't stop to figure out which it was. I took those stairs 2 and 3 at a time, one hand on the railing, the other still gripping my flashlight, even though I wasn't really aiming it at anything useful anymore, just letting the beam swing wildly with my momentum. Somewhere around the first floor landing, I lost my footing, caught myself on the railing hard enough that I felt it in my shoulder for days afterwards, but I didn't go down completely. Just stumbled and kept moving, because stopping wasn't really an option my body was willing to consider at that point. I remember the sound of my own breathing being almost as loud in my ears as my footsteps, ragged and uneven, the kind of breathing you can't really control once panic takes over.
I do remember getting to the side door I'd come in through and finding it shut. I know I left it open. I specifically remember it being propped open by debris when I came in, partly because the hinges were broken anyway and it wouldn't have stayed shut on its own. It was closed when I got there, fully closed, and for one absolutely horrible second, I thought it might be locked too. It wasn't locked, thank God, just shut. I shoved it open and didn't stop running until I was through the gap in the fence and back on the road, and I didn't stop walking fast until I was back at my car with the doors locked. I sat in that car for probably 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole way home. At one point, sitting there in the dark with the engine running but the car still in park, I made myself look back toward the building through the trees. I couldn't see much from that distance and angle, just the vague dark shape of it against a slightly less dark sky. But for a second, just a second, I thought I saw movement near one of the upper floor windows. A shift in the darkness that could have been a shadow from a cloud passing in front of the moon, or could have been something standing there looking back out at the parking area where my car was. I didn't wait around to figure out which. I never went back. I haven't done any urban exploring since, honestly. Not even places that have nothing to do with that hospital. The hobby just lost whatever appeal it used to have for me. I tried once, about 2 months later, to go check out a much smaller and far less notorious abandoned building, an old strip mall on the other side of the city that some friends were planning to visit, and I made it as far as the parking lot before I just couldn't make myself go inside. I told them I wasn't feeling well and waited in the car. They didn't push it, but I could tell they thought it was strange, since I'd always been the one pushing everyone else to go further into these places before. I looked into the building's history more after that night, found some old local newspaper archives about it, and there was apparently an incident decades ago, before the place fully closed, involving a security guard who went missing during an overnight shift and was never found. The official explanation at the time, according to what I could dig up, was that he probably just walked off the job. People did that sometimes back then, but his car was found still in the lot weeks later, and nothing about it was ever fully resolved as far as I can tell. There was a brief follow-up article maybe a year after the initial report, mentioning that the family had basically given up hope of finding any answers and that the case had gone cold, filed away the way a lot of cases from that era eventually were when there wasn't enough evidence or resources to keep pursuing them. I also found, buried in a different archive, a mention of the facility itself having had some kind of unspecified incident on the upper floors back when it was still operating as a psychiatric ward, something that resulted in at least one patient death under circumstances the article was frustratingly vague about. The kind of old reporting that hints at something without ever directly stating what actually happened, probably out of some combination of different journalistic standards back then, and likely legal concerns from the facility itself trying to control the narrative. I don't know if that has anything to do with what I experienced. I don't know what I experienced, honestly, not for certain. Footsteps could maybe be explained away. Old buildings really do shift and settle and make weird sounds. I've read enough about how temperature changes can cause that kind of creaking and shifting in old concrete and metal structures. But breathing that close, that clear, with nothing there when I looked, I don't have an explanation for that one. I've stopped trying to find one. Some nights I still think about that hallway and what I would have seen if I'd kept the flashlight on instead of turning it off, whether seeing whatever was breathing that close would have been better or so much worse than not knowing at all.
I genuinely can't decide which answer I'd prefer.
This happened a few years back when my best friend Derek and I decided to check out this old farmhouse that had been sitting empty for as long as either of us could remember. We grew up in a pretty rural area, and this place was maybe 15 minutes outside of town, set way back from the road on what used to be working farmland before whoever owned it stopped farming it and eventually just left. I want to say up front that this wasn't some random place we'd heard about online or through strangers. Everyone in town kind of knew about this farmhouse. It had been abandoned since before either of us were born, according to our parents, and there were always stories, the kind that get passed around small towns, about what supposedly happened there or who supposedly used to live there. Nobody ever seemed totally sure of the details, just that something bad had happened a long time ago, and the family had left and never come back, and the property had just sat there decaying ever since, technically owned by someone but never maintained, never sold, never torn down. Derek and I had talked about checking it out for years, the way you do with that kind of local legend when you're a kid, all talk and never actually following through because you're scared and don't want to admit it. We were 22 when we finally actually did it, which in hindsight is a little embarrassing. Two grown adults finally working up the nerve to do something we'd been daring each other to do since middle school. We went on a Saturday afternoon, which felt like the safer choice. Plenty of daylight, no reason to be scared of an old empty house in broad daylight. We parked Derek's truck on the shoulder of the access road and walked the rest of the way in, maybe a half mile through overgrown fields that used to be cultivated, now just tall grass and the occasional rusted piece of old farm equipment half swallowed by weeds. The house itself, when we finally reached it, was honestly smaller than I expected based on how big the legend around it had always felt. 2 stories, white paint long since peeled away to bare gray wood, a porch that sagged dangerously on one side. There was a barn set back behind it too, in even worse shape than the house, roof partially collapsed. We went into the house first. The front door wasn't even locked, just stuck from years of swelling and warping, and Derek had to put his shoulder into it to get it open. Inside was about what you'd expect from a place abandoned that long. Furniture still scattered around in some rooms covered in decades of dust, wallpaper peeling in long curling strips. It had that particular abandoned house quiet to it, the kind where every footstep on old floorboards sounds enormous. We spent maybe an hour just wandering through it, taking pictures, talking about what we imagined the family who used to live there must have been like, the normal stuff you do exploring a place like that with a friend. Nothing felt wrong yet, it just felt sad mostly, that particular kind of sadness old abandoned homes carry, evidence of a whole life just left behind and slowly rotting. It was when we went out to the barn that things started feeling different. The barn was darker inside than the house had been, less natural light getting through the gaps in the wood siding. Derek had brought flashlight, good thing too, because without it we genuinely wouldn't have been able to see much past the doorway. The space inside was mostly empty, old hay long since rotted to compost in the corners, some rusted tools hanging on the walls, a few stalls that must have housed animals decades ago. There was a ladder leading up to a loft area, and Derek wanted to check it out. I remember being more hesitant about the barn than I'd been about the house, something about the darkness of it, the way sound seemed to carry differently in there, but I followed him anyway because I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. The loft was mostly empty too, more old hay, a few wooden crates stacked in one corner. We were poking around up there, Derek's flashlight cutting through the dust we'd kicked up, looking at some old farm records that had somehow survived in one of those crates, faded ledger pages with handwriting we could barely make out anymore, when we both heard it at the same time. A sound from below us, down in the main barn area we'd just come from. A creak, the kind a floorboard makes under weight,
except the main barn floor down there was packed dirt, not floorboards. There shouldn't have been a creak like that at all. We both froze. Derek looked at me, and I could tell from his face he'd heard exactly what I'd heard and was thinking exactly what I was thinking, which was that someone or something was down there with us.
We waited. Total silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then it happened again. The same creaking sound, this time followed by what sounded unmistakably like a footstep, slow and deliberate on that same supposedly solid dirt floor. Derek killed the flashlight. I don't think either of us discussed it. It was just instinct. The same instinct that tells you to go quiet and still when you sense something's wrong. We crouched down near the edge of the loft, peering through the gaps in the old wooden floor down at the barn below, but it was too dark to see anything clearly, just vague shapes and shadows. The footsteps continued, slow, methodical, moving across the barn floor below us. They seemed to circle, like whatever was making them was walking the perimeter of the space rather than moving in a straight line toward anything specific. I remember trying to track the sound in my head, trying to picture exactly where it was relative to us. And the worst part was how impossible it became after a minute or two, because the footsteps didn't follow any pattern I could anticipate. They'd pause for 10 or 15 seconds and then resume from what sounded like a completely different part of the barn, like whatever it was could move without making any sound at all when it wanted to, and only chose to make noise sometimes. I remember Derek grabbing my arm at one point, and when I looked at him in what little light there was, he mouthed something at me. No sound, just the shape of words. He was asking if I'd seen anything. I shook my head. He pointed toward the ladder, the way we'd come up, clearly suggesting we needed to find another way down or wait it out. There wasn't another way down. That ladder was the only access to the loft. We were stuck up there with whatever was walking around below us, and going down that ladder meant being completely exposed for the several seconds it would take to climb down. No cover, no way to move quickly. We waited. I genuinely don't know how long. Time gets strange in moments like that, but it felt like a long time. The footsteps continuing their slow circuit below us, occasionally pausing, occasionally starting again from what sounded like a different part of the barn. At one point, I became convinced I could hear something else underneath the footsteps, a low sound that might have been breathing or might have been wind finding its way through the gaps in the old barn siding, and I genuinely couldn't tell which it was, no matter how hard I strained to listen. Derek later told me he'd heard the same thing, and had assumed it was wind too, or at least had desperately wanted to believe that's what it was. There was a moment, maybe 10 minutes into this whole ordeal, where the footsteps stopped entirely and didn't resume for what felt like an unbearably long stretch. I remember thinking, hoping that whatever it was had left, had moved on, had given up and walked back out of the barn the way it presumably came in. I started to relax my grip on the edge of the loft floor, started to think about whether it might be safe to whisper to Derek about climbing down. That's exactly when the footsteps started again, and this time they sounded closer than they had before, like the pause had just been it repositioning itself rather than leaving. At some point, the footsteps stopped directly below the loft opening, directly below where the ladder was. We both went completely still, barely breathing. I remember staring down through the gaps in the floorboards, trying to make out any shape at all and seeing nothing but darkness. Then we heard breathing, clear, audible breathing coming from directly below the ladder opening, slow and deep. The kind of breathing that doesn't sound rushed or scared, the kind that sounds like someone or something completely calm and in no hurry at all. Derek made the call. He grabbed my arm again and pointed at the small barn door. The loft had its own separate opening on the outside wall, probably originally meant for loading hay directly into the loft from outside. It was maybe 4 feet off the ground on the exterior wall and looked out onto open field. He mouthed that we were jumping.
I don't fully remember agreeing to it. I just remember following him to that opening and looking down at a drop that was higher than it looked from inside, easily 10 or 12 feet to the ground outside. Derek went first. I heard him land hard, heard him grunt in pain, but immediately scramble up and tell me to jump.
I jumped, landed badly, twisted my ankle pretty badly actually, but adrenaline kept me moving. We ran from that barn without looking back, across the overgrown field, all the way back to the truck, and Derek practically had to drag me the last stretch because my ankle had started to really hurt by then. I remember at one point glancing back over my shoulder despite every instinct telling me not to, just a quick glance, and seeing the dark shape of the barn behind us against the late afternoon sky, no movement visible anywhere around it, nothing chasing us that I could see, which somehow made the whole thing feel even more unsettling rather than less. We didn't talk much on the drive back into town. I remember just sitting there in shock, replaying that breathing sound over and over in my head, trying to figure out what could possibly explain it, and coming up with nothing that made sense. Derek pulled over once, maybe 5 minutes from town, just to sit for a second and collect himself. His hands were shaking on the wheel badly enough that I think he genuinely didn't trust himself to keep driving safely. We didn't say much during that stop either. Just sat there in silence, both of us staring straight ahead like we expected something to come walking up the road behind us, even though we were already a couple miles from the farmhouse by that point. We never went back to that farmhouse. For months afterward, neither of us brought it up much, like there was some unspoken agreement to just not talk about it unless we had to. It wasn't until almost a year later, at a bonfire with some other friends, that Derek finally told the story out loud to other people, and I remember being surprised by how much detail he still remembered, like the whole experience had just been sitting there preserved in his memory exactly as it happened, never really fading the way most memories do over time. Years later, I asked my dad if he knew anything about the farmhouse's actual history, beyond the vague stories everyone in town always told. He said he'd heard, secondhand from his own father, that the family who used to live there had a son who went missing as a teenager, decades before either Derek or I were born, and that the family eventually just left the property entirely rather than keep living there with that unresolved. He said nobody ever found out what happened to the kid. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there'd been some talk at the time about the search efforts focusing heavily on the barn and the surrounding fields specifically, because that's apparently where the boy was last seen by a younger sibling before he disappeared completely. Though my dad admitted he wasn't entirely sure how much of that detail was accurate after being passed down through so many years of retelling. I don't know if that's connected to what we experienced in that barn. I don't know if anything is connected to anything when it comes to stuff like this. It's all just stories and feelings and things you can't fully explain after the fact. What I know is that Derek and I both heard the exact same things, both felt the same overwhelming need to get out of that barn by any means necessary, and neither of us has ever wanted to set foot on that property again. Derek moved away a couple years ago for a job out of state, and even now, when we talk on the phone occasionally, that farmhouse still comes up sometimes, usually unprompted, like it's a memory that just surfaces on its own without either of us trying to bring it up. This happened during my last year of college, when a few of us decided to check out an old elementary school that had been closed for almost 20 years. I want to give some context because I think it explains why we ended up there in the first place. There were 5 of us total, all friends from the same dorm building, and it started as one of those late-night conversations where someone mentions a place and suddenly everyone's decided it's happening that same night. No real planning, just impulse and the particular kind of fearlessness you have at 20 years old at 2 in the morning. The school had closed when enrollment dropped too low to justify keeping it open, consolidated with another school across town, and the building itself had just sat empty ever since because the district couldn't figure out what to do with it. some ongoing dispute about funding for demolition versus repurposing that apparently never got resolved. It sat there for 2 decades, slowly decaying, fenced off but not particularly well secured. We drove out around midnight, 5 of us crammed into one car, the kind of energy where everyone's half excited and half nervous and trying to act braver than they actually feel. The school was on the edge of what used to be a residential neighborhood that had mostly emptied out over the years too. Half the houses around it boarded up or just gone entirely, demolished and never rebuilt on. Getting in wasn't hard. There was a side entrance where the door had been pried open at some point by previous visitors, clearly not the first people to have this idea. We went in single file, 5 phone flashlights cutting through the dark, immediately hit with that same smell every abandoned building seems to share, mildew and dust and decades of stagnant air. The hallways were narrower than I expected, lined with old lockers, most of them hanging open, paint peeling off the walls in long strips. There were still posters up in some places, faded almost completely from sun exposure through broken windows, barely legible anymore, but clearly the kind of bright educational posters you'd see in any elementary school, alphabet charts, motivational sayings, that kind of thing. Something about seeing those, still hanging there after 20 years in a building that should have had kids running through it, hit different than I expected. It wasn't scary exactly, just deeply sad in a way none of us were prepared for. We split into 2 groups at some point, 3 of us going one direction down the main hallway, 2 of us, myself and a girl named Priya, going the other way, toward what looked like it used to be the gymnasium, based on a faded sign still partially attached to the wall near the doorway. The gymnasium was a huge open space, basketball hoops still hanging at either end, the wooden floor warped and buckled from water damage over the years. Our flashlights barely reached the far walls. The space was that big and that dark. We walked toward the center of it, talking quietly, taking some pictures, generally just absorbing how strange it felt to be in a place clearly designed for noise and activity and kids, now this silent and empty. That's when we heard, very clearly, the sound of a basketball bouncing. Not from us, neither of us had touched anything, and there was no ball anywhere visible in the beam of our flashlights when we both immediately swept them around looking for the source. The sound came from somewhere near the far end of the gym, 3 or 4 distinct bounces, the kind of rhythm someone makes dribbling a ball while walking, and then it just stopped. Priya grabbed my arm immediately. We stood there in total silence, both of us straining to hear anything else. Nothing followed it. After what felt like a long time but was probably under a minute, we heard it again, this time from a different part of the gym, closer to where we'd entered from. We started backing toward the doorway we'd come in through, not running yet, just moving with purpose, flashlights sweeping wildly, trying to catch any sign of movement or any indication of what could possibly be making that sound in an empty building. We found nothing. No ball, no person, nothing visible at all. We got back into the hallway and immediately tried calling out to the rest of our group, our voices echoing down that long, empty corridor in a way that honestly made things feel worse rather than better. No response came back from them right away, and for a horrible few seconds, I genuinely thought something had happened to the rest of our group.
They came around the corner about 30 seconds later, and the look on their faces told me they'd experienced something too, even before any of us said anything. Turned out their experience was different from ours, but somehow equally unsettling. They'd been exploring what used to be a row of classrooms, and one of them, a guy named Marcus, swore he heard what sounded like a piece of chalk writing on an old chalkboard in one of the rooms they passed. He said it was unmistakable, that specific scratching sound chalk makes, coming from inside a room they hadn't even entered yet. When they went into that room to check, the chalkboard at the front was completely blank, just years of dust and grime, nothing written on it at all, and definitely no chalk anywhere visible that could have made the sound. We all stood together in that hallway for a minute,
comparing notes, trying to rationalize what we'd each heard. Old buildings settle, pipes make noise, animals get in and move around. There's always some logical explanation people reach for in these moments. But the basketball bouncing rhythm, 3 distinct dribbles in a recognizable pattern, that wasn't easy to explain away as settling or pipes or an animal. Neither was chalk on a board that had nothing written on it. We decided, somewhat unanimously without much discussion, that we were done exploring for the night. We started heading back toward the side entrance we'd come in through, moving faster now, all 5 of us sticking close together instead of spreading out the way we had been. As we passed back by the gymnasium doorway on our way out, all 5 of us heard it at the same time, the basketball sound again, except this time it didn't stop after a few bounces. It kept going, a steady rhythm, like someone was actually playing, dribbling continuously, somewhere in that dark open space we left maybe 10 minutes earlier. Nobody said anything. We just moved, fast, almost jogging now down that final stretch of hallway toward the door. I remember the sound of our own footsteps suddenly feeling impossibly loud, all of us breathing hard, nobody wanting to be the one who looked back to check what was happening behind us. We got out through that side door and didn't stop moving until we were back at the car. All 5 of us crammed back in, doors locked, someone immediately starting the engine even before everyone had their seatbelts on properly. I remember looking back at the building one last time as we pulled away, just a glance through the back window, and for a second the silhouette of the school against the night sky looked completely still, completely normal, exactly like an empty, abandoned building should look. That somehow didn't make me feel better at all. Nobody talked much on the drive back to campus. I think we were all individually trying to process what had happened and figure out how to even put it into words. We ended up at a 24-hour diner near campus instead of going straight back to the dorms, none of us really wanting to be alone yet, and we sat there for almost 2 hours just going over every detail again and again, trying to piece together a timeline of exactly what each of us had heard and when. It wasn't until the next day that we really talked through it as a group with clearer heads, comparing every detail, trying to find some explanation that made sense. Marcus kept coming back to the chalk sound specifically, said it was the part that bothered him most because it was so specific, so deliberate sounding, not like a random scrape or settling sound, but like an actual writing motion, the kind of sound you'd recognize instantly because you've heard it 1,000 times in your own childhood classrooms. None of us came up with an explanation that satisfied everyone. What we did find, a few days later when one of us got curious enough to look into the school's history, was that there had been an incident at that school decades before it closed, well before any of us were even born. A young student had died on school grounds, some kind of accident in the gymnasium specifically. The details were vague in what we could find online, mostly just an old local news archive reference without much elaboration. The article didn't go into detail about exactly what happened, just that it had happened, and that the school had observed a period of mourning before resuming normal operations afterward. We dug a little further after that initial find, mostly out of morbid curiosity at that point, and found a second, shorter article from around the same time period. This one focused more on the school's response, mentioning that classes had been suspended for nearly a full week following the incident, an unusually long closure for what the article vaguely described as a tragic accident during a physical education period. There was no further elaboration on what exactly happened, no names mentioned beyond a brief reference to the family requesting privacy, and nothing in any subsequent archive we could find about whether the family ever pursued anything further or whether the school faced any consequences. I don't know if that has anything to do with what we all experienced that night. I want to be honest that I genuinely don't know what to believe about any of it, even now, years later. What I know is that 5 separate people heard sounds in an empty building that none of us could explain, sounds that were specific and patterned in a way that didn't match any reasonable natural cause we could come up with. A basketball bouncing in a gym with no ball. chalk on a board with nothing written. None of us have ever gone back. We talked about it a few times in the months after, half-jokingly suggesting we should do a daytime visit just to prove to ourselves there was nothing to be afraid of. But it never actually happened, and eventually we just stopped bringing it up. Priya told me, years later, after we'd both graduated and lost touch with most of that original group, that she still thinks about it sometimes, especially whenever she happens to drive past an old abandoned school in whatever city she's currently living in. That same specific feeling from that night coming back to her in a rush, even from a distance, even from inside a moving car with the doors locked and nothing actually threatening anywhere nearby. I think about it too, more than I probably should given how many years have passed. There's something about that particular building, about a place specifically designed to be full of children's noise and energy, ending up that silent and empty for 2 decades, that makes whatever we heard that night feel less like a random haunting and more like an echo of something that was supposed to be there all along, just delayed, just waiting for someone to come back and listen.